You think you know Sparta. You've seen the movie, you've heard the legends. Six-pack warriors, crimson capes flowing in the wind, shouting defiance at impossible odds. But what if I told you that nearly everything Hollywood showed you was a beautiful lie? What if the real Sparta was darker, stranger, and far more brutal than any film could stomach showing? What if the warriors you idolize would terrify you if you truly understood what they had become? Before we descend into that world together, tell me, which country are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Are you settling in for the evening or stealing a few minutes during your lunch break? Because I'm about to take you somewhere the sun never really warmed, where childhood ended at 7 years old, and where the greatest warriors the ancient world ever produced paid a price so horrific that their own allies feared and despised them. Let me take you to a place that existed not in myth, but in blood-soaked reality. A place where mothers handed their sons over to the state and never got them back. Where boys learned to steal or starve. Where teenagers murdered in cold blood as a rite of passage. And where the elderly had no word for retirement because they never stopped preparing for war. This is the Sparta that existed. This is the machine that turned children into something that barely resembled human beings anymore. The year is 425 BC, and somewhere in the Peloponnesian hills, a 12-year-old boy whose name we'll never know crouches in the darkness. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. His tunic is thin, deliberately so, because comfort makes you weak. The scars on his back from last month's flogging have barely healed. He got caught stealing food, but not because stealing was wrong. He got caught because he was clumsy. In Sparta, that's the only crime. His hands are wrapped around a rock. In the distance, he can hear the helots, the slave class that outnumber Spartans 7 to 1, working the fields that feed the city. The boy's orders are simple, given to him and every other child in the Agoge, the brutal education system that owns him now. Find a helot, alone, at night. Kill them. Don't get caught. Come back a man, or don't come back at all. This isn't a scene from a horror film. This is the Crypteia, the secret culling that Spartan teenagers conducted every single year, a state-sponsored terror campaign against their own enslaved population, designed not primarily to control the helots, though it did that too. No, it was designed to kill something inside these boys, to take whatever empathy, whatever mercy, whatever normal human softness remained in them after 5 years of systematic brutality and burn it out completely. You won't see this in the movies. You won't see the Spartan warrior vomiting after his first kill at 13. You won't see him lying awake, wondering if the man he stabbed in the dark had children. Because by the time he's 20, he won't wonder anymore. He won't feel it anymore. The machine will have done its work. Let's go back further, because to understand what Sparta created, you need to understand where it started. Not on the battlefield, in the cradle. When a Spartan baby was born, it didn't belong to its parents, it belonged to the state. Within days of birth, that infant was brought before the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, and inspected like livestock. They looked for deformities, for weakness, for any sign that this child wouldn't become a perfect instrument of war. We don't know exactly what criteria they used. We don't know how many babies failed the inspection, but we know what happened to the ones who did. They were taken to the Apothetae, a chasm in the Taygetus Mountains, and thrown over the edge, left to die of exposure or predators or the fall itself. Their parents had no say, no appeal, no goodbye. Imagine being a Spartan mother, holding your newborn for perhaps a day, perhaps only hours, knowing that old men you've never met will decide if your child lives or dies. Imagine the walk to the council. Imagine waiting. Imagine the moment they hand your baby back to you, and you know you've passed. For now. Because this is only the first test. Modern scholars debate the historicity of infant exposure in Sparta. Some argue it was exaggerated by Athenian propagandists. Others point to the archaeological evidence, the small bones found in that mountain chasm, though their dating remains inconclusive. But what isn't debated is this. Sparta created a society so thoroughly militarized that ancient writers across the Mediterranean world, friend and foe alike, agreed on one thing. Spartan childhood was unlike anything else in the Greek world. It was systematic, it was brutal, and it started long before a child could understand what was being done to them. For the first 7 years, Spartan boys lived with their families, though even then their upbringing was harsh by ancient standards. They were fed sparingly, dressed lightly regardless of weather, and discouraged from crying or showing fear. Spartan girls, uniquely in Greece, were also trained physically, wrestling, running, throwing javelins. Not because Sparta believed in gender equality, but because they believed strong mothers produced strong sons. Everything, always, was about creating warriors. Then came age 7. The age when, in most Greek city-states, boys would begin learning to read and write, to play music, to recite poetry. The age when childhood, in any recognizable sense, should have been just beginning. In Sparta, it ended. They called it the Agoge, which translates roughly as the raising or the leading. It was compulsory for all Spartan boys, regardless of wealth or family status. At 7 years old, you were taken from your home and placed into an agoli, a pack or herd. The terminology itself is revealing. You were no longer a child. You were livestock being trained. You slept in barracks on beds you made yourself from reeds you gathered from the riverbank with your bare hands. No mattresses, no blankets even in winter. You were given 1 cloak per year. When it wore out, that was your problem. You bathed in cold water. You were fed barely enough to survive on, the famous black broth, made from pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. Ancient sources tell us it tasted so vile that when a visiting dignitary from Sybaris, a city famous for luxury, tasted it, he remarked, "Now I understand why Spartans don't fear death." The hunger was intentional. You were encouraged to steal food to supplement your rations, but if you were caught, you were beaten savagely. Not for stealing, for being caught. The lesson was clear. Deception and cunning are virtues. Failure and weakness are crimes. One story, possibly apocryphal but repeated throughout antiquity, tells of a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When the owner approached, the boy stood at attention and said nothing, even as the fox, trapped and terrified, clawed and bit into his stomach. The boy remained silent, expressionless until the owner left. Then, he collapsed. The fox had torn through to his organs. He died without making a sound. Whether this story is true or not is almost irrelevant. What matters is that Spartans told it about themselves with pride. This is what they aspired to. This is what they thought excellence looked like. A child dying in agony rather than admit weakness. The physical training was relentless. Running, wrestling, fighting with fists and sticks and later weapons. But the Agoge wasn't just about physical conditioning, it was about psychological reconditioning. Breaking down everything a child naturally is, curious, playful, emotional, individual, and rebuilding them as something else. A unit in a phalanx, a weapon that thinks only of the man to its left and its right. They learned to move in formation from the time they could walk steadily. They learned songs not of love or nature or the gods, but of military victories and noble deaths. They learned that the greatest honor was to die in battle holding your position. They learned that retreat, survival, living to see your family again, these were acts of cowardice worse than death. And they learned to inflict pain without flinching. If you're still watching, I need you to do something for me. Take a moment and hit that subscribe button, because this story goes deeper and darker than you probably imagined, and you're going to want to see where this ends. Trust me. The teenage years in the Agoge were when the true horror began. Around age 12, boys entered a phase called the paidiskoi. Their hair was cropped short. They walked barefoot year-round, even in mountain winters. The beatings intensified, not as punishment for specific infractions, but as routine conditioning. There was even an annual ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys were whipped, sometimes to death, while trying to steal cheeses from the altar. Crowds gathered to watch. Families cheered on their sons. The boy who endured the longest without crying out was honored. Think about that. Parents watching their children being whipped bloody, shouting encouragement. What does it do to a society when suffering becomes theater, when endurance of pain becomes the highest virtue? But the Crypteia was different. The Crypteia was secret. Somewhere between ages 18 and 20, the most promising young Spartans were selected for this ritual. They were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a knife and orders to survive by stealth. During the day, they hid. At night, they hunted. Their prey wasn't animals, it was helots. The helot system was Sparta's original sin, the foundation on which everything else rested. After conquering Messenia in brutal wars during the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Sparta had enslaved entire populations. These helots worked the land, produced all the food, did all the labor that Spartan citizens refused to do because they were too busy training for war. The helots outnumbered Spartans catastrophically. Some estimates suggest ratios of 7 or even 10 to 1. This terrified Sparta. Every year, upon taking office, the ephors, Sparta's magistrates, would formally declare war on the helots, not metaphorical war, actual legal war. This meant that killing a helot wasn't murder, it was a military act. No trial, no punishment, no consequence. And the Crypteia took this annual declaration and made it operational. Young Spartans were sent out to murder helots, targeting particularly the strong, the intelligent, the natural leaders, anyone who might organize resistance. It was terrorism as state policy. It was genocide as education. And it worked. The helots lived in constant terror. They had no legal recourse, no protection, no hope. They could be killed at any moment by invisible hunters in the dark. And those hunters? Those were boys, teenagers, being taught that some human lives have no value, that killing is easy, that mercy is weakness. What does that do to a person? What does that do to a soul? By the time a Spartan man reached age 20 and became a full citizen, a homoios, a similar one, identical to all other Spartans, he had been systematically brutalized for 13 years. He had been starved, beaten, frozen, and forced to commit murder. He had been taught that his life had value only as part of the collective, that individual thought was dangerous, that questioning orders was treason, that compassion was contemptible. He was, by any modern definition, a traumatized victim of child abuse on a societal scale. But Sparta called him a warrior, the finest warrior the world had ever seen. And in a narrow, terrible sense, they were right. When Spartan hoplites formed their phalanx, the dense formation of overlapping shields and thrusting spears that dominated ancient Greek warfare, they were virtually unstoppable. Not because they were stronger or faster than other Greeks. Athenians, Thebans, Corinthians were all trained warriors too, but Spartans had something else. They had been conditioned since childhood to never, under any circumstances, break formation, to hold their position even when arrows darkened the sky, to stand firm even when cavalry charged, to keep fighting even when the man next to them fell. Because breaking formation wasn't just tactical failure, it was the ultimate sin, the negation of everything they'd suffered to become. The Spartan shield was large and heavy, designed not primarily to protect the man carrying it, but to protect the man to his left. Your shield covered his unprotected side. His shield covered yours. If you ran, you weren't just saving yourself, you were murdering your brother. This was drilled into them with such ferocity that Spartan mothers famously told their sons, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning return victorious or return dead. Don't return in defeat. There's a chilling story about a Spartan soldier who survived a battle where most of his unit was killed. He returned to Sparta expecting punishment perhaps, but also hoping to be with his family. Instead, he was shunned completely. No one would speak to him, no one would look at him. His own mother turned her face away. He was called the Trembler, a man who had trembled in battle. Within weeks, he hanged himself. This is what Sparta created. Men so psychologically destroyed, so thoroughly rebuilt in the image of military perfection, that survival itself became unbearable if it came at the cost of honor. In 480 BC, 300 of these men marched to Thermopylae under King Leonidas. You know this story, or think you do. The narrow path, the massive Persian army, the heroic last stand. But here's what the movie doesn't tell you. Those 300 were selected specifically because they had living sons. Sparta sent fathers, not because they were expendable, but because their genetic line was secured. The mission wasn't to win, it was to die well. To buy time, yes, but more importantly, to create a legend that would echo through centuries. They succeeded. For 3 days, Spartans and their Greek allies held the pass against Xerxes' hundreds of thousands. When they were finally outflanked and surrounded, Leonidas dismissed most of the allied forces. The Spartans stayed. All 300 died. Not one retreated, not one surrendered. Thermopylae became the defining myth of Sparta, proof that their brutal system worked, that their sacrifice of childhood, of humanity, of everything soft and kind in human nature produced something glorious. Warriors who could not be broken.
But there's another way to read Thermopylae. 300 men, conditioned from age 7 to believe that their only value was to die for the state, did exactly what they'd been programmed to do. They had no choice. Not really. The Agoge had taken choice from them long ago. They were brave, yes, courageous beyond measure, but they were also victims. Children stolen by the state and transformed into weapons. And we've been celebrating that theft for 2,500 years. You still with me? Good. Because we need to talk about what happened when the wars ended. Or rather, what happened when the wars became less frequent. Because Sparta had built a machine with only one purpose, and when that purpose wasn't needed constantly, the machine began to devour itself. Spartan citizens, the homoioi, couldn't work. Labor was for helots. They couldn't engage in trade or commerce. That was for the perioikoi, the free non-citizens who lived around Sparta. Spartan men were full-time warriors. That was their entire identity. When they weren't fighting, they were training. When they weren't training, they were eating together in their syssidia, their communal messes, where they were required to dine every single night, away from wives and families, with their military units. Spartan marriage was itself bizarre. Men typically married around age 20, but continued to live in barracks until age 30. They could visit their wives, but only secretly, at night, as if they were conducting affairs. Some men had children before they'd ever seen their wives in daylight. The state even encouraged wife sharing if a man was infertile. The goal was producing more Spartan children, not romantic love or family bonds. Everything in Sparta was subordinate to military necessity. And for a while, it worked. Sparta became the dominant military power in Greece. After defeating Athens in the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, Sparta briefly ruled an empire. It lasted less than 30 years. Because Sparta's system, for all its military brilliance, was catastrophically fragile. They couldn't replace losses. Every Spartan warrior represented 20 years of training, and their population was tiny, probably never more than 8,000 or 9,000 full citizens at their peak, and declining steadily. They couldn't adapt. The Agoge produced perfect hoplites for phalanx warfare, but when tactics evolved, when other Greek states learned to counter the phalanx, Sparta couldn't innovate. Their entire society was built on tradition and obedience. Questioning, creativity, individual initiative, the tools needed to adapt to changing circumstances, had been beaten out of them in childhood. And they couldn't sustain their helot system. In 371 BC, Thebes defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra, shattering the myth of Spartan invincibility. Then Thebes invaded the Peloponnese and liberated Messenia. Suddenly, the Helots, who had grown all Sparta's food, who had enabled Spartan citizens to train full-time for war, were free. Sparta didn't collapse overnight. It declined, slowly, painfully. The population dwindled. The rigor of the Agoge relaxed, not because Spartans wanted it to, but because they couldn't sustain it. By the time the Romans arrived, Sparta was a tourist attraction. Wealthy Romans would visit to watch staged reenactments of the ancient customs, like visiting a theme park of cruelty. The whippings at Artemis Orphea's altar continued, but now they were theater, performance. The boys being flogged were doing it for paying audiences, not for the state. The system that had once produced the finest warriors in Greece now produced only spectacle. And here's the question I want you to sit with. Was it ever worth it? Sparta sacrificed everything human on the altar of military excellence: childhood, family, love, art, literature, philosophy, individual identity, freedom. They created warriors who could stand at Thermopylae and refuse to break. But they also created a society so rigid, so inhuman, so utterly consumed by war, that when the wars ended, nothing remained. Athens, Sparta's great rival, produced Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They built the Parthenon. They created democracy, for all its flaws. They wrote tragedies and comedies that we still perform today. They debated and argued and questioned everything. And yes, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. But when you think of ancient Greece today, what do you think of? Do you think of Spartan efficiency and discipline? Or do you think of Athenian philosophy, art, and ideas that shaped all of Western civilization? Sparta bet everything on the belief that strength and discipline and martial excellence were the highest virtues. They built a machine to produce warriors who couldn't be defeated. And for a time, they were right. Spartan warriors were the best. But what did it cost? What did they lose in that bargain? Every Spartan boy torn from his mother at 7. Every teenager forced to kill to prove his manhood. Every helot murdered in the dark by a child taught that some lives don't matter. Every Spartan woman who raised strong daughters and brave sons, but never had a husband who lived at home. Every old warrior who had survived decades of war only to discover he had no idea how to live in peace. The Spartans would tell you it was worth it. They'd point to Thermopylae, to their victories, to the fact that for centuries the mere threat of Spartan intervention was enough to end conflicts. But I'm asking you, do you believe them? Here's what we know. We know that Sparta produced incredible warriors. We know that their system, brutal as it was, achieved its narrow goal. We know that their sacrifice, and make no mistake, every Spartan citizen was a sacrifice, bought them military supremacy. We also know that Sparta produced almost no literature, no philosophy, no art of lasting value. We know that they lived in constant fear of Helot uprising, so much so that they declared war on their own enslaved population every single year. We know that their population declined steadily because their system was so harsh that many didn't survive it, and those who did had fewer children. We know that when their military dominance ended, they had nothing else to fall back on. And we know that those 300 warriors at Thermopylae, as brave as they were there by choice. Not really. They were there because from age 7 they'd been conditioned to believe that dying for Sparta was the only life worth living. That's not heroism. That's tragedy. The legend of Sparta has endured for more than 2 millennia because it speaks to something we want to believe, that discipline and sacrifice and strength can overcome anything. That if we're just tough enough, hard enough, willing to endure enough pain, we can become invincible. But the truth of Sparta teaches us something else. It teaches us that strength without humanity becomes monstrous. That discipline without compassion creates cruelty. That sacrifice without purpose is just suffering. That you can be the best warrior in the world and still lose everything that makes life worth living. Sparta turned children into weapons. And yes, those weapons were effective.
but they were still children who deserved to play, to love, to grow up free from terror and pain. The Agoge didn't make them strong. It broke them and called the broken pieces strength. So I'll leave you with this. The next time someone tells you we need to be more like Sparta, that we need more discipline, more toughness, more willingness to sacrifice for the collective good, ask them this question. Ask them what they're willing to give up. Ask them what they're willing to break. Ask them if they're ready to throw babies off mountains and send 12-year-olds out to commit murder in the dark.
Because that's Sparta. Not the movie, not the legend, the real Sparta. The one that existed for centuries, turned human beings into instruments of war, and in the end, left behind almost nothing but graves and cautionary tales. Was it worth it? That's for you to decide. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if you think Sparta's sacrifice purchased something valuable, or if it was just cruelty dressed up as virtue. I want to know what you think. And if this story made you think differently about the legends we celebrate, hit that like button and share this with someone who still believes the movie got it right. Because history isn't about heroes and villains. It's about human beings making choices, and those choices having consequences that echo through centuries. Sometimes those consequences are beautiful, and sometimes, like with Sparta, they're just broken children in bronze armor, standing in formation, waiting to die.